Welcome back to Vlogs of History After Hours. I'm your host, Darius Cosden, and if you've missed this week's episode of Vlogs of History, I really do encourage you to go check it out. I'll leave a link right here. We've talked about Jack the Ripper, and it contains a lot of background information that's going to be very useful in understanding this video. So if you haven't checked it out, make sure to do so right now. So what I want to talk about in this Vlogs of History After Hours episode is the general concept of a London slum. Because we've talked about the Jack the Ripper, well, Jack the Ripper committed all of his murders in Whitechapel, which is a district in London's East End. And London's East End is often referred to as the London Slums, especially during the Victorian era. Now, for those unfamiliar, the Victorian era is the era where Queen Victoria had her rule. And it was a very dark area for the London's East End, especially for the districts there. Why? Well, simply because before the Victorian era, that area, London's East End, was very prone to traders and industrialization. There was a lot of market going on because they were close to a river. So a lot of ships would be coming in and would be departing from London's East End. But when the Victorian era came to be, when Queen Victoria came into power, that was also the time that the Industrial Revolution was happening all over Europe, and especially in London. And so a lot of workers, well, their jobs were being replaced by machines, and they just couldn't work. They weren't skilled enough to work. You had a very big population of unskilled workers that were left with just no jobs. Nonetheless, because of this shift from a more agricultural style of production to a more industrialized style of production, well, it attracted also a lot of people to London's East End because a lot of factories were opening up, and when you have factories, well, you need people to operate those factories. You need a little more skilled workers, and so a lot of people became attracted and came to London's East End, which is good. From an economic point of view, that's good. But what wasn't good was the fact that, well, the housing conditions didn't change. There weren't, the new houses were not being built at all. And so you had a limited amount of accommodations for an ever increasing amount of people coming in. So what happened was you had very poor living conditions, and for the people, there were families living in one room, and you had very little hygiene. I mean, there was a lot of disease in London's East End that wiped out thousands of people, if not more. And because when you also have a lot of people coming in to look for jobs, well, the employers and the factory workers, they can afford to lower the wage of said jobs. Because when you have a lot of people wanting jobs, well, you can lower the wage and people will still want to work because they are that desperate. Because of that, well, wages were lower, and there were so many people who just couldn't find a job, and there was a lot of unemployment. And so that area really became known as London's poor area. All the poor people were there. And if you were somebody who was poor at the beginning and you managed to make a little bit of money somehow, well, you were not going to stay there. You were going to move out. Nobody would stay in Whitechapel. Nobody would stay in London's East End. And because of that, well, it left with a concentration of poor people in London's East End. Only those who really were stuck there, who really couldn't find a better alternative to their living situations, only those people would remain there. And because of that, well, when you have poverty, like I've mentioned in the Vlogs of History episode, when you have poverty, you have crime, you have prostitution. Prostitution was huge in Whitechapel, in London's East End. I mean, there was a study that about 1,200 prostitutes were operating in London's East End during the time that Jack the Ripper did his killings. And on top of that, you had Jack the Ripper, who killed 5 women, and then you had other Whitechapel murders, as they call it, all happening in London's East End. I mean, from an outside's perspective, well, what kind of reputation does London's East End have? I mean, you have crimes, you have prostitution, you have murders, you have Jack the Ripper. Who would want to live there? Nobody would want to live there. Everybody who was there, well, they were trying their best to get out as fast and as easily as possible. And that was a hard thing. And also because of that, a lot of factories were in the London's East End because all of the toxic fumes at the time, because factories at the time and still today, they produce a lot of toxic fumes, and it was a way to separate those toxic fumes from London's rich populations, which were in the city of London. So all of the factories, all of the dirty factories became there and had their like establishments there, and a lot of the workers who would work there, well, they would become dirty, and that really did not help the whole situation. And that's really the background of London's East End. Like, I didn't want to go into too much history, but I just wanted to give you a background on that, on the London's East End, and see where Jack the Ripper operated. Because it's important to know, Jack the Ripper really, his killings, although he was never caught, his reputation, everybody knew Jack the Ripper. He's one of the most famous serial killers in the world. I mean, I've done my video on Jack the Ripper. I'm pretty sure that you've heard of Jack the Ripper before me doing the video. Granted, you may not know the full story behind it, but you may at least have heard the name. And because of that, well, London's East End had a terrible reputation, and Jack the Ripper was one of the people who helped London's East End get that horrible reputation. So that was it for this week's episode of Vlogs of History After Hours. I do hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like, share it to a friend, and subscribe to be notified when the next episode comes out. Once again, if you've missed this week's episode of Vlogs of History, you can check it out right here. Once again, it talks about Jack the Ripper. So now we've covered the background of London's East End and Whitechapel. So go check that out to see exactly what happened with the Jack the Ripper. How did he killed? How come he was never caught? All of that I covered in great detail in this episode. I put a lot of work into it, so make sure to check that out. With that being said, I'm your host, Darius Cousin. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I will see you all next week.